Good evening. I want to start tonight in a place that, geographically speaking, is very far from the United States. A vast island, cold, sparse, quiet most of the time. Greenland. It is not a place that usually leads the evening news here. It is not a place most Americans think about on a daily basis. And yet, in recent days, it has become the focus of a declaration that is drawing attention well beyond Washington. Former President Donald Trump has said there will be no going back on his aim to gain control of Greenland. That phrase matters. No going back. It is definitive. It closes doors rather than opening them. And it signals something meant to be heard not just by a domestic audience, but by allies, partners, and rivals abroad. Trump made this declaration while sharing leaked text messages and artificial intelligence-generated images. The images depict U.S. territorial claims over Greenland, not maps from a history book. Not archival documents, AI mock-ups. That detail is important, because it tells us something about how this message is being delivered and how it is meant to land. This is not a quiet policy paper. This is not a diplomatic memo. This is public, visual, and intentionally provocative. There's no going back. That line lands with weight because it leaves very little room for interpretation. Greenland is a territory of Denmark. Denmark is a member of NATO, and that alliance structure is built on trust, mutual defense, and shared expectations about sovereignty. Trump's statement has alarmed European NATO members. Not confused them, alarmed them. That distinction matters. The reaction has not been limited to expressions of concern. It has prompted discussions about trade tariffs. It has opened conversations about broader diplomatic rifts. These are not symbolic responses. They are practical. They are consequential. When European allies start talking about tariffs in response to a territorial claim involving AI-generated imagery, that tells you something has shifted, and it tells you the message was received. Russia, watching this unfold, also weighed in. Russian officials questioned Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. That intervention adds another layer. Because Russia's interest here is not incidental. When a U.S. political figure publicly asserts an unyielding aim to gain control of a territory tied to a NATO member, and Russia then questions that member's sovereignty, it creates a complicated picture. A picture that does not resolve itself easily. Trump's sharing of leaked texts alongside the AI images reinforces that this was not accidental. It was curated, it was chosen, and it was released with intention. The texts themselves have not been framed as hypothetical. They were presented as part of the same narrative as the images. Together, they tell a story of resolve, a story of insistence, a story that says this idea is not abandoned, not softened, not walked back. No going back. You can hear how that sounds when spoken aloud. It is not exploratory language. It is not conditional. It does not say, consider. It does not say, discuss. It says the opposite. And for European NATO members, that tone is not abstract. Because NATO is not just a military alliance, it is a political commitment. It is built on the assumption that borders are respected among allies, that territorial integrity is not a bargaining chip. So when that assumption is shaken, even rhetorically, the response is serious. Trade tariffs come up in those conversations not as punishment, but as leverage, as signaling tools, as a way to say, this matters. And again, Russia's involvement complicates the picture further. By questioning Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, Russia is not simply commenting. It is inserting itself into a conversation that already carries tension. That insertion does not calm the situation, it sharpens it. This is how geopolitical moments begin to stack. One statement, one image, one reaction, then another. There's no going back. It is a sentence that echoes differently depending on where you hear it. In Washington, it may sound like defiance. In Europe, it sounds like a warning. In Moscow, it may sound like opportunity. And Greenland itself, vast and quiet, becomes the focal point of all of it. Not because it asked to be, but because it has been placed there. We are still in the opening moments of this story. The declarations have been made, the reactions have begun, and already the lines are visible. When statements like this are made publicly, they do not exist in isolation for long. They begin to move. They begin to interact with other interests, other governments, other sensitivities. And that is what we are watching now. After Donald Trump shared the leaked texts and the AI-generated images asserting U.S. territorial claims over Greenland, the response from Europe did not take the form of a single press release or a single objection. Instead, it spread. European NATO members reacted with alarm. That word matters. Alarm is not curiosity. It is not confusion. It is a recognition that something potentially destabilizing has been placed on the table. Greenland is not an abstract idea to European allies. It is connected to Denmark. Denmark is connected to NATO. And NATO is a structure that depends on predictability. The idea that a former U.S. president would publicly declare there is no going back on an aim to gain control of Greenland disrupts that predictability. And it does so in a way that feels intentional. The use of AI-generated images is part of that. These were not accidental visuals. They were not illustrative diagrams tucked into a policy briefing. They were shared. They were meant to be seen. Images asserting U.S. territory claims carry a different weight than words alone. They linger. They circulate. They invite interpretation even when none is explicitly offered. And that is before we get to the leaked texts. Leaked texts suggest something private made public. They suggest authenticity, whether warranted or not. They suggest that this is not just a rhetorical exercise, but something discussed behind closed doors. Taken together, the texts and images present a posture of certainty. There's no going back. That line sits at the center of this moment. For European NATO members, that certainty raises immediate questions. Not about intent alone, but about consequences. Because if an ally's territory is discussed as something that could be taken or controlled, even rhetorically, it forces a recalibration. And that recalibration is where trade tariffs come in. Discussions of trade tariffs are not theoretical. They are practical tools. They are levers that governments consider when diplomatic norms feel strained. The fact that such discussions have been prompted tells us the seriousness of the reaction. This is not just about Greenland. It is about precedent. If one NATO member's territory can be publicly framed this way by a prominent U.S. political figure, it raises concerns about the stability of shared assumptions. Those assumptions are what allow alliances to function without constant renegotiation. And when they are questioned, even indirectly, the response is measured but firm. Russia's reaction adds another dimension entirely. As European allies were absorbing Trump's declaration, Russia questioned Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. That is not a neutral observation. Russia questioning sovereignty is a signal. It signals interest. It signals attentiveness. And it signals an awareness of the tension already in play. Russia's involvement does not create the tension, but it amplifies it. Because now, what might have been a bilateral concern between the U.S. and European allies becomes something larger. It becomes something observed and commented on by a strategic rival. That matters. When Russia questions Denmark's sovereignty, it does so against a backdrop of its own history with territorial claims and disputes. And while no direct equivalence is stated, the echo is unmistakable. This is how international moments accumulate weight. One declaration leads to one reaction. That reaction invites another voice. And suddenly, the frame is wider than it was at the start. Greenland itself remains unchanged in all of this. It is still there, still vast, still sparsely populated. But politically, it is now positioned at the center of a conversation that involves AI technology, leaked communications, NATO cohesion, trade policy, and global power dynamics, all triggered by a single phrase: no going back. There is something striking about how absolute that sounds in a diplomatic context. Diplomacy usually leaves room for dialogue, room for revision, room for recalibration. This phrase leaves none, and that is why it resonates so strongly with allies. Because absolutes force choices, they force responses. European NATO members are not responding emotionally, they are responding structurally. They are considering tariffs. They are discussing diplomatic rifts. They are reassessing how this statement fits into the broader alliance framework. None of this happens quickly, but it does happen deliberately. And Russia, by questioning Denmark's sovereignty, inserts itself into that deliberation. It does not offer solutions. It offers pressure. That pressure changes the environment in which European allies must respond. And it complicates the choices they face. There are moments when words redraw the map. That is one of those moments. Not because borders have changed, but because the conversation around them has. The AI images matter here because they blur lines between imagination and assertion. They look official. They look finished. They present an outcome rather than a question. And in international politics, presentation carries meaning. Leaked texts matter because they suggest continuity of thought. They suggest this idea is not fleeting. And when those elements are combined with an unequivocal statement, the effect is cumulative. This is not about whether anything will happen next. It is about what has already happened. A declaration has been made. Reactions have followed. And the diplomatic atmosphere has shifted. Greenland, Denmark, European NATO members, and Russia are now linked in a single unfolding sequence of responses, each one reacting to the last, each one adjusting posture, and all of it anchored to that initial assertion: no going back. The weight of that phrase does not diminish as it travels. If anything, it grows heavier with each reaction it provokes. By the time we reach this point in the story, something important has already happened. Not in policy, not in law, not in borders, but in tone. Donald Trump's declaration that there is no going back on his aim to gain control of Greenland has already done its work. It has moved from statement to signal, from signal to reaction. And now it sits in the open, shaping how multiple governments are thinking at the same time. This is often how consequential international moments look at the beginning. They do not arrive with treaties or troop movements. They arrive with language. And in this case, the language was absolute. Trump shared leaked texts and AI-generated images depicting U.S. territorial claims over Greenland. Those elements were not separated from one another. They were presented together. That pairing matters. Because words alone can be dismissed as rhetoric. Images alone can be dismissed as artifice. Together, they suggest intent. European NATO members understood that immediately. Their reaction was not delayed. It was not muted. They were alarmed. And alarm, in diplomatic terms, is a signal of seriousness. It says this is not being filed away as a curiosity or a thought experiment. It says this is being taken at face value. The discussions that followed reflected that seriousness. Trade tariffs were raised as a possibility. Broader diplomatic rifts were discussed. Those are not symbolic gestures. They are tools that governments reach for when trust feels strained. And that is the key word here: trust. NATO functions on the assumption that member states respect one another's sovereignty. That assumption is not ornamental. It is foundational. When that assumption appears to be challenged, even rhetorically, the response is not optional. It is required. Russia's response fits into this picture in a way that is subtle but significant. By questioning Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland, Russia did not create a new issue. It attached itself to an existing one. That attachment changes the context. Because now, what might have been a contained disagreement among allies becomes something observed and commented on by a strategic competitor. That matters not because of what Russia said, but because of when it said it. Timing is everything in diplomacy. Russia's questioning of sovereignty came as European NATO members were already expressing alarm, as discussions of tariffs and diplomatic consequences were already underway. It added pressure at a moment when cohesion was already being tested. And that pressure does not dissipate on its own. Greenland itself remains unchanged in physical terms. Its geography is the same. Its population is the same. But politically, it has been repositioned. It is now at the center of a conversation about sovereignty, alliance norms, and the use of emerging technology in political messaging. The AI-generated images are a particularly modern element of this story. They represent something new in how territorial claims can be visually suggested without formal declaration. They are not official documents, but they look authoritative, and that appearance is part of their power. In international affairs, appearance often precedes action. It shapes expectations. It frames debate. The leaked texts add another layer. They imply continuity of thought. They imply that this is not a passing idea, but something that has been discussed and considered. Whether or not that implication is accurate is beside the point. What matters is how it is perceived, and perception here has driven response. There are moments when a sentence does the work of a policy. This is one of those moments. No going back. It is a sentence that forecloses negotiation in its phrasing, even if no formal negotiation has begun. It leaves allies asking what comes next, not because something has happened, but because something has been said. And that is often enough. European NATO members are now navigating how to respond without escalating, how to signal concern without fracture, how to maintain alliance integrity in the face of unsettling rhetoric. Those are not simple calculations. They involve trade, diplomacy, and public messaging. They involve coordination among multiple governments with different domestic pressures. Russia's presence in the conversation ensures that these calculations are made with additional caution. Because when sovereignty is questioned by a rival power, even indirectly, the margin for error narrows. This story does not end with a resolution. It ends with a landscape that looks different than it did before. A landscape where Greenland is no longer just a distant territory, where AI images are part of geopolitical signaling, where leaked texts shape international reaction, and where a single phrase has set multiple governments into motion. No going back. That line remains exactly where it was when it was first spoken. Unqualified, unsoftened, and because of that, it continues to resonate. Not as a plan, not as a policy, but as a marker. A marker of how quickly the ground can shift when language, technology, and power intersect in public view. This is how these moments begin, quietly in some ways, loudly in others. And long before anything changes on a map, something has already changed in the conversation.